Hi.
Nice to see you. So we'll start as usual with a little bit of practice. Once again, let's settle into a posture that we can use for practice for this next period of time. Upright, alert, and relaxed, steady. And let's spend some time now practicing cultivation of compassion. You can practice in any way that you like, any method of cultivating compassion that's familiar to you. If you'd like guidance, then you can listen to these instructions. We'll begin by connecting with the sense and desire for suffering to end. You're aware of suffering in your own experience. You're aware of other people, other beings that you care about that suffer. Connect with that desire for that suffering to end. You can find it in your own body, perhaps, in your heart, or anywhere else in your body. Cultivating, appreciating, spending time with the desire for beings not to suffer. And if you like, you can also explore repeating a word or short phrase that for you is associated with compassion. So if you like, you can say just the word compassion, or may you, or we, or I, whatever works for you, be free from suffering. You can get creative, try something else. Come to something that you can just repeat. Continuing to cultivate compassion. Repeating this word or short phrase that you've chosen and allowing that to impact your body, allowing it to interact with and bring forth a sense of compassion. As well, if you like, bringing in images, considering, imagining those who are experiencing suffering and wishing for that suffering to end for them. You become very aware of cruelty, pain, injustice in the world. Let that feed the desire for that cruelty, that pain to end, and for the suffering based on it to end. Maybe that we ourselves experience suffering in some way. We can wish for our own suffering to end. Connect with the desire for our own suffering, as well as that of all other beings, those we care about, those we are aware of, all of that suffering to end. For some, it may be helpful to imagine a glowing ball of light in your heart associated with this feeling of compassion. You imagine that light shining forth, spreading, reaching out and touching those for whom we have compassion. If that works for you, then you can feel free to explore that. And if not, that's okay. Cultivate compassion in whatever way works for you. And bring this compassion out throughout the whole world. Spread it as far as it will go. But it includes all those everywhere who are suffering. There are those who have been affected by, harmed by racial injustice, to wish compassion, wish for resolution for their suffering. Those affected by the pandemic that's still ongoing, you wish for their suffering to end, their situation to be resolved. All those of the world who are lonely, scared, confused, have lost their livelihood, their way of living and understanding the world. All of the non-human life, the animals, the trees, the plants, face destruction due to the actions of people and others. And spreading it so that it includes the whole world, everyone in it. Those born and those yet to be born. All the people alive now and all those who will ever live. Cultivate this compassion, this desire for their suffering to be resolved. The genuine love, care, concern. Wishing well for every living being throughout the entire universe. So, nice to see you. Nice to be able to look at some of you and to know that some more of you are perhaps listening, paying attention, and to consider who else might be watching this throughout the remainder of time. We have this wonderful technology of the internet, which lets us record and revisit things. So, and again, nice to see many of you again. I didn't see you all last week. I was taking a little bit of time off. Very important to take time off for everyone, and so I took some time off. And I'm very glad, actually, that I took that time off, because it gave us all an opportunity to hear from Pan and from Magic. I'm very grateful to them for having shared and brought their wisdom, their perspective to this community. Very grateful that we have a way for Pan and for Magic and perhaps others to share, to express what their truth is and what they've learned of this path of the resolution of suffering, of being of benefit to all beings, of being truly happy. Very grateful. Any of you who weren't here last week would do well to listen to that. Do well to tune in and watch the recording on YouTube. Go through the whole thing. I went through a lot of it. And it would do you much good to hear the wisdom that was shared. You should pay close attention to it, take it in, internalize it, and act accordingly. And this, to me, is very exciting. It means that we have created something in which not just I, but other people can share, can offer their perspective, and can be of true service. Also makes me happy because I wouldn't have done things the same way as Pan. Certainly wouldn't and couldn't have done things the same way as either Pan or Magic. It would have been a very different event. And so I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to do that. I've often said that Pan and I are two people who disagree on a lot. We see things very differently and approach things very differently. Many of the things that Pan says, I would never say. I would never even consider saying. And the same is true, of course, for Pan. Many of the things that I say, Pan would never say. Many of the things that I do, Pan would never do. And we disagree often profoundly, often very significantly, and on issues that are of great importance to both of us. And yet, despite that, I'm now here telling you, you should listen to Pan. You would do well to listen to Pan, to hear that talk, internalize it, and live your life according to it. You would do very well to listen to that talk and act according to it. Because this community, this training, is not about views. This training is not about views. This path is not about views. This path goes beyond, transcends every way of seeing, every perspective, every way of understanding. And so it's really heartening to me. It's very encouraging to me that we have created something in which people who have different views can share their views and can cooperate, in which we are able to cooperate even independently of views. And why is this so heartening to me? Well, because we currently have a really hard time cooperating independently of views. This is a big problem for us. We taken on increasingly narrow ways of seeing things for the past thousands and hundreds of years. And we've come to the point where there is now really one culture that has taken over most of the world, that has taken over and displaced, eradicated all other ways of seeing things. One way of looking at things, or maybe a few ways of looking at things that are in competition with each other. But basically one landscape. And we've seen that we are very good at collaborating based on views. It's kind of our thing as the human species. We're very good at entering into a dream world and then living our lives according to that dream. And doing so together with other people so that everyone shares the same dream. And in that way, people can be trusted. People can work together and collaborate. But only as far as the view goes. We can only collaborate on the terms of the view. And as soon as we disagree, all of the power that's conferred by the view is immediately gone. So, why is that? So there's one view in particular that is not represented in the sutra that we've been studying. So for those of you just coming in, we've been for a little while in a series on a particular text in the Pali Canon. And this text discusses various ways of seeing things that were active, that were dominant at the time of the Buddha in India 2,500 years ago. And it spends some time going through and enumerating these views. It talks about the various, ancient Indian religions, such as materialism. Some crazy view that people believed in India 2,500 years ago, that you are your body, that death is the end of all experience, that there's nothing in the world but matter. The four great elements, as they would say at the time, or as we would say now, I don't know how many there are, but however many elements, 100, 200, how many elements are there? Anyway, how many? 250 some. 250 some. So there's nothing but the 250 some elements, and with death, the oxygen goes and joins the rest of the oxygen, the carbon joins the rest of the carbon, the nitrogen joins the rest of the carbon, and nothing else remains. This ancient Indian religion. We have spent some time going through these. There are still a couple of views left in the text, but I decided to actually take a bit of a diversion to talk about a view that isn't discussed. A view that is actually, as far as I can tell, if not been innovated, at least come to prominence in the modern world. One that has been produced, or at the very least has been developed and enthroned since the time of the Buddha. So this is actually already very interesting, that it's a view that wasn't intact as is 2,500 years ago, in much the same position it is now, because a lot of the views that we hold now were intact in the time of the Buddha. It's very interesting. So the view I'm talking about is the view of humanism. The view that, as they say, man is the measure of all things. That the way value is understood is based on human understanding. That the value of life is the value of that life to humans. That how we should live is entirely based on how humans think or feel we should live. This view wasn't discussed in that sutra. I should say, while it wasn't as prominent as it is now, it wasn't entirely absent. The Buddha actually does talk about this view at other times. He does say that this is an instance of wrong view, but it isn't mentioned in the sutra, perhaps because at that time in India, there wasn't any major school that followed it. It was generally regarded by most of society, in fact, as a crazy and extremely dangerous way of seeing things. The idea that you're going to live your life according to the human heart and mind. This was seen as utter insanity, and not just by ancient Indian culture, but by most cultures in the world historically. It's been emphasized throughout history that our passions are to be reined in, clarified, even overcome. And so the idea that you should live your life according to that, according to how you feel, according to what you want, has not been followed for much of history. We now, of course, often have a hard time seeing this view at all, because we are so identified with it that it just sounds like the truth. It either sounds ridiculous if we're hearing about it, or it sounds like just the way that things are if we're acting according to it. We can hear someone say to follow capricious, fleeting human thoughts and feelings is insanity, to take human thoughts as the basis of the universe is insanity, and we can agree with that, right up until we have a thought or a feeling that we believe in and want to act according to. Then, well, that thought is true, whatever it is. And so we tend to look at these other cultures who didn't hold this view as backwards and crazy. A salient example, a simple example to talk about is the practice of arranged marriage, which, as we are familiar with it, I think we sort of think of it as something that comes from India. We have the sense arranged marriages are things that happen in Indian culture. And we find that very strange. We think that's awful. That's at the very least nonsensical and possibly evil, possibly barbaric, cruel. Whereas our own approach to marriage is just taken with blind faith to be the correct way to do it. How do we go about marriage? Well, you meet someone, you fall in love with them, and then you maybe move in together for a little while, and then you get married, based on this passion, this love, the sense of love, or the sense of maybe alignment, the sense, yes, you think the same things I think, or you make me feel in such wonderful ways. We have a real sense that this is not just a reasonable way of going about it, but the only reasonable way of going about it. And yet, as anyone who has been married for any great amount of time can confirm or deny, if I'm just completely off base here, if you just spend a few years with someone, you will find yourself in an arranged marriage. You will find yourself married to someone who you don't like all that much, who you don't even know. You thought that this person was so wonderful and interesting and smart and right and good. They made you feel so nice and happy and wonderful. You just spend a few years with them and you realize, oh, wait a second. That was an idea. That wasn't that person at all. The person who I loved so much, who I agreed with so much, was just an idea in my head that I projected onto the world. And I don't actually know who this person is. I don't agree with them. I don't even like a lot of things about them. And I don't even really feel all that good about them anymore. So here we are. We're now in an arranged marriage. It just took us 5 years to get to the place where people in Indian culture started on day one. So at that time, there's a real question of what do you do? What do you do when you realize that this person who was the perfect person, who was your partner, this perfect entity, just isn't that person? They're just another person. They're just a kind of messed up human being. What do you do at that point? Well, in Indian culture, the answer is simple. You build love. You cultivate love. You do the work of coming to see and understand this person who you don't know as they are, and you take on the practice of loving that person even in their flawedness, even in their inadequacy, even in their patterns and their tendencies, their ways of getting on your nerves. You just take on that practice of loving them. And of course, there's a difference in this case between Indian culture and our culture, is that in Indian culture, this pairing has been carefully thought out by your family and by the other person's family. There are many good reasons for you to be with this person. They've been carefully selected for you. Often throughout history, marriage has represented an alliance between families, between tribes, even between nations. That to have a way of coming to peace with another nation or building an alliance with a nation would involve a marriage in the royal family, for example. In our case, we just have the human mind's sort of random feelings of passion. We had some ideas that we were just holding on to for a little while and went beyond, and some feelings that were based in chemicals and subsided after a short amount of time. But okay, fine, no big deal. You can still do the same thing. It's still possible, as some in this audience can attest, to build love. In fact, to have a deeper kind of love than you could have based on mere ideas and mere passion. A kind of trust, a kind of caring, a kind of enabling of each other's life purpose, of each other's vow of service to all life. Kind of support that is independent of views. This is possible. You can ask my parents how they did it, if you like. I'll, just to save them a little bit of time, I'll just repeat what Soryu, my teacher, said about this on this topic. He was talking to some people who stayed married for 60 years once, and he asked them, how did you do it? How did you stay married for 60 years? And they said, well, we just didn't get divorced. So there you go. If you want to do this, then at the end of the day, you have to just make a commitment and then not break it. That's it. So, okay, we have a certain way of seeing things. There's a certain view that has come to prominence. Came to prominence, let's say, 500 years ago. Yes, maybe for the last 500 years, we've been giving it an earnest shot. This was when, I won't get into too many of the details. It's a fascinating story, but when a certain individual named Martin Luther nailed a list of demands or theses or complaints to the door of the church and basically said, look, people should be able to read the Bible on their own, come to their own conclusions, which you could say was part of humanism coming to prominence. And we've had, let's say, 200 years of humanism running the world, starting with, let's say, the French Revolution or so. Again, this is very approximate, hand-wavy history here. We've had about 200 years of this way of seeing things being in charge, really being the authority of us, giving the world over to this view. And so it's worth just looking at what has come of that. It's worth looking at where we are now. So in terms of Buddhism, there are 3 or maybe 4 basic issues to overcome in the human mind. The issues of greed, hatred, and ignorance, or you could say delusion. In my way of talking about this right now, I'm going to split ignorance and delusion up, and this may be ignorance and delusion. It's entirely possible that me saying this right now is an example of delusion. take it with a grain of salt, but here we go. Let's just play with it. Trying to gesture at something here. We now, in running our country and in running the world, to the extent that the US still kind of runs the world, is sort of in charge of the world, is de facto the one holding the biggest stick on the world stage and therefore running the show. We have come up with a political system in which there are two main factions. The faction on the left, let's say, is a mass movement that's based primarily on hatred and delusion. Hatred primarily of the other faction, but also of others on the left who they disagree with. Sort of a movement that's based on hatred and delusion, and the other side, the right, you have a mass movement based primarily on greed and ignorance. So here we are. What do we do here? Do we try to beat the side that advocates, that uses, that feeds on, that gains its force from greed and ignorance, overcoming it with hatred and delusion, various ways of seeing things that don't accurately meet reality, views, construals, ideas? Or do we try to beat this hatred and delusion using greed and ignorance, denial of reality, denial of the reality of what's happening, and desire for our own personal gain or the gain of people like us in various ways? Well, this is why I picked the quote that I picked for the description of this event. It's a quote from the Dhammapada, one of the most well-read and in many ways most significant texts in the Buddhist tradition. The quote saying that hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal. This is actually a rather extreme statement. A statement that hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. We heard this same message, of course, last week. And it's true. I agree with it. I'm very grateful that it was said so clearly. That if we attempt to meet this with hatred, with division, with a wish for these to be harmed, those to be harmed, for these people to go away, for those people to go away, for these people to just be different from how they are, for those people to be different from how they are, we won't shift things. Buddha says here, this is a law eternal. He's saying basically garbage in, garbage out. This is a law eternal. If you feed hatred into the system, then what you get out is hatred. It says elsewhere, well, I won't get into the full opening text because that could easily be a week of talks and we wouldn't begin to cover it, but the very next line here is significant. Buddha says that there are those who do not realize that one day we all must die. But those who do realize this settle their quarrels. So here we begin to have a little glimmer of a clue of what to do, what is to be done instead. We look at this system that's running the world and we see that it's an engine feeding on greed, hatred, delusion, and ignorance, that it's consuming many people's lives, that it's causing massive injustice, cruelty, and often cruelty to those who are least able to do anything about it, and to those who have done the least to produce it. To, in this country, people of color primarily, and also to those in the world who have less power, the many billions of people in the world who are facing food insecurity right now, to say nothing of the non-human life in the world. We see that this whole way of doing things isn't working. What do we do instead? Well, the Buddha says that by non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. And he then goes on to say that there are those, this is the very next line, who do not realize that one day we all must die. Those who do realize this settle their quarrels. So at this time right now, we are facing a great number of crises. We're facing still the crisis of the coronavirus, which we've responded to by putting 4 billion people in lockdown, in isolation, in which we now can see our response was based, it wasn't ever based in an honest attempt to reduce harm, because we've now, both sides, concluded that there's something that's more important than lockdown. One side is now saying that the economy is more important than lockdown, that people need to go back to work in order to gain material wealth. The other side is saying that racial justice is more important than lockdown, that people must gather in large numbers, that the cost of a potential second wave killing a large number of people is one that we are willing to pay for this. This whole time, this response to this crisis was motivated by primarily a fear of death, an unwillingness to realize that we must die, that one day we all must die. So we can see that now with what maybe now is the last major mass crisis, the one that last activated the human mind at scale, the mind that's running the world. We can see this with the last crisis. And so while, again, I'm not by any means disagreeing with any of what is being said, well, it's extremely important that we work to combat, to resolve, to move beyond racism, particularly in the police and throughout the whole of society. The energy behind this mass movement is also primarily about our own unwillingness, inability to realize that one day we all must die. So we see now this mind of humanism again and again just responds to this fundamental fear of death, through fear, through divisiveness, through hatred. It just again and again keeps on grabbing onto the next thing that agrees with it and following that. But what do we do instead? If we want to actually end this cycle, if we want to actually resolve the crisis of coronavirus, of racial injustice, and of climate change, of the threat of terminal war, what do we do instead? Now, I'm not claiming to have the answer here. I'm not claiming to have the only answer. I hope it's obvious that I'm speaking from a position of humility and just presenting my own view here. What do we do instead? And again, I don't mean to say that we shouldn't be protesting, that we shouldn't be raising awareness. I don't mean to say that we shouldn't be taking steps to prevent people from getting infected, to ensure the health and well-being of people. It's sort of like your nice metaphor that Soryu used for this actually a while ago is that suppose you have a patient who's sick and you have two groups of people. One of them is attempting to treat the symptoms and the other is attempting to find a cure or a vaccine. You don't consider these two groups to be enemies. These two groups of people are friends and they are working on the same thing. Someone is sick, to resolve the underlying issue and to treat the symptoms are both beneficial. It isn't that you have to only treat the symptoms, and if you don't treat the symptoms, then you're cruel and evil. And it isn't that you have to resolve the underlying issue, and if you only focus on the symptoms, then you're shallow and not doing anything. I hope that we don't see things in such an immature way, that we are able to honor and respect everyone who is doing this work, regardless of even our own view of it. That we're able to support those who care and who are working to resolve these issues. So the answer that I'm going to put forth for what we do instead is that we build communities that are based on wisdom and compassion, that are based on overcoming greed, hatred, and delusion and ignorance, that we ourselves purify our own minds so that we ourselves move beyond greed, hatred, and ignorance, and that we build communities in which other people are doing this as well. We experience and find and see clearly the issue in our own minds, the issue that creates these other issues, and we in our own minds resolve it. And we in a community, ideally with people who we don't agree with people who we aren't around just because we want to be around them, but with people who we wouldn't choose to be around, so that we can do the work at a deeper level, so that we can resolve this at a deeper level. Find out what happens. What happens when I act based on greed, hatred, and delusion? What happens when I act based on wisdom and compassion? What is greed, hatred, and delusion? What is wisdom and compassion? Find these things out experientially and directly, so that we can practice actual non-hatred. Moreover, that in these communities we face death. We face the reality of our own death, and we face the death of other beings, those we care about. We see deeply the impermanence, the untrustworthiness of this world, of conditioned phenomena. And seeing that, we search for what is not tainted by suffering, and is not tainted by greed, by hatred, by delusion. We search for that. These communities, wherein people are doing actual work, these people then go into the world, start other communities. These communities may then be able to form a collective intelligence that is based on a mind freed from these obstructions, freed from these issues. And through doing this hard, slow, unglamorous, challenging, confusing work, we actually shift the basis of this culture, shift the basis of the world. We can look up to and appreciate those who are doing this work. I feel very fortunate to live in a community where people are doing this work. I sit here every day with people who are heroic, who are admirable, who are facing confusion, discomfort, again and again being in situations where they're asked to go beyond themselves, where we're asked to go beyond ourselves. And a community in which we can collaborate independently of views. A community in which Pan and I can both give talks. Which, for those of you who have been here for the last 2 weeks, you may now have a sense of the significance of. This is possible. This has been done historically. It hasn't, obviously, succeeded entirely. We only need to look around the world to see that the work is not done, that no one has succeeded completely. But it has been done. If you ask anyone, who are the people who have influenced the world most? Who are the people who have had the greatest power throughout history, who have caused the most impact? And in fact, the most impact based on compassion, based on wisdom. Many of these people are people who have done this, who have followed spiritual lives, who have lived this kind of life. It's a disproportionate number of people. It's an unusual number of people. And it isn't that it's some kind of people who do this. It isn't the case that there is some group of people that does this and the others don't. The Buddha, in fact, was very clear on this, as to mention it, that there were really two main teachings that the historical Buddha, who was, in my view, one of the people who had one of the largest beneficial effects on the world in history, possibly even at the top of the list. Buddha had two teachings that he wouldn't budge on. There were many things that he just went with, just took on, collaborated with people on. But there were two teachings that he would not move on. The first was the teaching of non-self, teaching that there is not a separate, trustworthy self, someone that's worth being called me, or is worth being looked at as a possession of me, anywhere to be found. Would not budge on this. He also would not budge on the teaching of racial justice, the teaching that it is not by birth, by skin color, by social status, that we should judge people, but by actions. Wouldn't budge on this, and in fact was radical and revolutionary in creating a system that freed people from the caste system, a system in which anyone of any status, of any race, could go forth and, on the spot, be free from slavery, free from oppression, venerated, just on the basis of that having gone forth. Was the first person in the world to create, as far as I know anyway, an organization governed by and for women. Created the Bhikkhuni Sangha, which he refused to be in charge of, that it should be governed by women. And again, at a time when women were viewed as property, said that anyone who goes forth, anyone who makes the commitment to this training, ceases to be anybody's property. It got him into a lot of trouble at the time, but he did that. So I hope that we, as we continue this tradition, and as we innovate a new tradition, can find and see the truth in these teachings. Well, and by mentioning a certain poem that the Buddha recited at some point, describing a time when he was in the situation that we now find ourselves in, situation internally at least, not externally, but internally, much like the one that we are now in. He says, when embraced the rod of violence, and violence here means not just physical violence, it does mean physical violence, but it also means verbal violence, harsh, divisive, false speech, and it even means mental violence, hatred and ill will, covetousness, merely as thoughts. The rod of violence breeds danger and fear when it's embraced. Look at people quarreling. Look around, look at people quarreling. He says, I will tell of how I experienced dismay, seeing people floundering like fish in small puddles, competing with one another. As I saw this, fear came into me. The world was entirely without substance. All the directions were knocked out of line. Wanting a haven for myself, I saw nothing that wasn't laid claim to. Seeing nothing in the end but competition, I felt discontent. So, this may be heartening to some of us. We, looking around us, and we see there's nothing to trust, there's nowhere to stand. The stuff that I thought was permanent and unchanging is actually impermanent and changing. The stuff that I thought I could trust and rely on is actually untrustworthy and unreliable. The ways of life that we thought that we could depend on turned out to just vanish in a moment. The ways of seeing things that we believed in turn out not to be real, not to be true. Even our own actions, our own heart, our own mind turns out not to be trustworthy, not to be reliable. We look around and in every direction, there's nothing. There's no sanctuary. All the directions were knocked out of line. And so he continues, then I saw an arrow here, so very hard to see, embedded in the heart. Overcome by this arrow, you run in all directions. But simply on pulling it out, you don't run, you don't sink. If we are able to go beyond hatred, we're able to pull out the arrow of hatred, of ill will, of greed, of ignorance. We're able to stop doing that, find a way out of these patterns. Then we cease to be battered around by this world. The poem continues, and it's actually quite long and elaborate, and I don't have time to give the whole thing right now, but the end of it I will give. It says, not harsh, not greedy, not perturbed, everywhere in tune. This is the reward, they say when asked, for those who are free from preconceptions. For one unperturbed who knows there's no accumulating. Abstaining, unaroused, they see everywhere security. The sage doesn't speak of themselves as among those who are higher, equal, or lower. At peace, free of selfishness, they do not embrace, and they do not reject. We now have a chance to practice putting this into practice. Chance to cultivate this state of mind. A chance to overcome hatred, overcome greed, overcome delusion in our own experience. So that we, from that clear state of mind, can move into this world and be of true service. Once again, take a moment to straighten up and settle in. Allowing the spine to grow long and the force of gravity and the earth below us to take on and hold our full weight. And we'll continue to cultivate compassion. You can resume right where you left off or start again by repeating phrase or word associated with compassion. By bringing forth visualization, image associated with compassion. Visualizing others, visualizing ourselves, visualizing that glowing light shining forth and meeting all beings. And cultivating the feeling of compassion, a true desire for suffering to end. And this is easy, let it be easy. It's challenging, let it be challenging. If all you can do is just repeat that word or phrase, say the word love in your head for a few seconds, then let that be enough. You may like to imagine, bring into your mind someone who you care for, someone for whom it's easy to feel compassion. Whoever that is, maybe a friend, a family member, someone close to you. Practice compassion for that person. And now, call to mind someone we just feel maybe neutral for, someone we don't know very well, we just see every now and then. And practice compassion for that person. You get in touch with the desire for that person not to suffer. It doesn't even have to be a real person. You can just picture someone you know in some situation. Just a cashier somewhere you sometimes go, and someone just walking down the street. Wish for that person's suffering to end. Now, picture someone for whom it's challenging to feel compassion. And set the bar appropriately, make it an interesting challenge, but feasible. And wish compassion for this person. And finally, your attention to yourself. Wish compassion for you. Wish for your own suffering to cease. Now, spread this compassion throughout the whole world, filling up the space in front of you, and compassion for every living being in that direction. Filling the space to the right of you, Having compassion for everyone, all living beings in that direction. And sending compassion behind you, wishing well, wishing freedom from suffering for all living beings in that direction. And sending compassion to your left, wishing for all living beings in that direction to be free from suffering. Spreading compassion in all directions, all beings everywhere, throughout the whole world. Wishing all of them freedom from suffering. thank you for doing that practice. And now I have a little bit of time for discussion. Any questions or comments, reports, experiences, anything at all is welcome. And it's also just fine to continue to sit together in silence. Yadira, were you trying to ask a question? No. Okay. Yeah.
When we were visualizing that word prior to the initial time, I kind of was flowing through words, and then it just stopped on love, and then it developed. So I saw it, and then it turned green, and it would beat like my heart, and every time it would beat, it would just kind of like reverberate out to the world, like that vibration of love. And I feel like I kind of got lost in that rhythm of that. So I feel like I'm still kind of coming back to from that. That was really nice. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. It's just really lovely to hear. As you say it, I kind of go into it, and it's really, it's very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could everyone hear that? Somebody couldn't hear that? Okay, sorry. So let me see if I can active listen back. Magic was saying that you practiced and you were going through words, and just sort of flipping through, and then it just stopped on love. And then you were visualizing that love, and it became this green energy light that then was synced up with your heartbeat. And then every time your heartbeat, it was reverberating out into the whole world.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, we need a better microphone set up here.
I have a couple of observations. Actually, I want to turn on my light now. 1 second. I was finding it, so I understand the idea of wishing compassion or of sending compassion, and I understand what is meant by wishing for someone, for a being not to suffer. But I was really struggling with the idea of wanting to end the suffering, because I instantly came to the idea of wanting for people to die. And I was reminded of, I think it was Albert Camus' statement that the only real philosophy question is, should I kill myself? And I don't have any further reflections on that, just stating how difficult it was for me to conceptualize ending suffering as not also wishing all death on life, or all death on earth.
Yeah, well said. So those words are commonly chosen in the Buddhist tradition. I'm not entirely sure why, but it was somewhat intentional on my part. I did mention that line from the Buddha. Those who realize that we will die cease their hatred, set their struggles aside, set their quarrels aside. So I shouldn't say intentional. That's actually a lie. I apologize. I'm not that good. I didn't intend to do that. I'm actually much better than that. I did that unintentionally. But I'm very glad that that happened, because it orients us towards that issue. It's a real question. what does it mean for suffering to end? What does it mean for it to actually end? Not just get a little better for a while, not just resolve in some ways, but actually completely end. Does that happen with physical death? This is also a good question. We in this culture have a certain view that says that it does. And physical death is the end of all suffering, but that view has not been common throughout history. And there are those today who disagree with it. It was a big question, and it's a very challenging thing to face. To ask that question and to face that challenge. But it doesn't seem, and I don't think it actually is right to just wish people to die. It doesn't seem good. And yet, the Buddha made a very clear statement regarding this topic. I often I joke about it sometimes with people. Someone's like, I'm in this situation and I thought it was going to be really good, but it turns out it's not so good. I actually have a lot of problems in this situation. To say, well, there's a quote by this one guy, the Buddha says there are problems. This is actually the first noble truth. This is the very first thing in the Buddhist teaching. The truth of suffering or the truth of problems. And the meaning of that truth, as I understand it in that tradition, is that we have problems right now. There's problems. And we will do a lot of work. We'll cultivate, we'll solve those problems, we'll grow, we'll develop, we will transcend, we'll go beyond who we thought we were. And having done all of that, we'll have problems. That as long as we're here at all, as long as there's anything, there are problems. So I'm not in a position to speak from authority on that. I don't understand what the Buddha meant by that just yet. I'm getting more and more of a sense of it, but I don't feel as though I can hold the same perspective as the Buddha on this topic. Yes, I don't know what he means, but it is very significant. So I'm curious, as you considered that, if you'd like to share, if anything came up, if you had a reaction to it or a sense of it.
Sadness, resistance, a sense that if I wished for my own suffering to end, that I would lose my motivations in life.
Yeah.
A lot of things that I was attached to.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, it's scary. And I can say that there is a reason that people often use the metaphor of death for moving on this practice. And it's that at a certain point that comes up really strongly. If we just stay on this path for a little while, then it really does feel like we're going to die. Like we'll lose all of our, like you say, everything that motivates us, everything that we believed in. With a sense that the person we are is dying. My experience of this, what dies is not us. For whatever that's worth. We find out that that wasn't actually us in the first place. Soryu has a lot of metaphors. Maybe familiar. You've met the guy. One of the metaphors that he often uses is to explain the situation. It's as though you've let a thief into your house. So someone's come up to your door and they're a thief. And they say, hey, it's me, your long-lost child. You say, oh, good. My long-lost child, how wonderful, you've come back. I didn't even know I had a child, but there you are, you've come back, so wonderful. Let's be together now. From now on, I'm going to care for you and treat you well. And then stuff starts going missing in our house. And so we ask the child to investigate and say, hey, child, stuff is going missing in my house. Could you tell me what's going on here? And so the child goes off and says, sure, I'll investigate. And then comes back and says, well, I don't really know what's going on, but those friends of yours, yeah, stop seeing them. Don't see them anymore. Stuff still keeps on going missing. And then at some point, there's a moment when you realize that you never had a child. And you feel so, it's like unfortunate. It's like, come on. I remember I knew I never had a child the whole time, but I just bought in and gave away my life to this thief. And at that time, we can even feel a sense of remorse, a sense of grief. It's like, oh no, I've lost my child. Which isn't actually true. You haven't lost your child. You never had a child. As Soryu says, this metaphor is not without meaning. It has meaning. What is the meaning? It's that a certain perception showed up at some point. It shows up and says, hey, I'm yourself. Good news, I'm yourself. And we say, oh, wow, I didn't realize I had a self. How wonderful. I'm now going to give everything to this self and do whatever the self says. And then suffering and misery shows up. It just keeps on showing up in our life. And we then ask ourselves, hey, me, what should I do about this? I'm having problems. There's suffering, there are problems. What do you think, me? How should I resolve this situation? And so our self says, well, stop interacting with those wise, trustworthy people. They're dangerous. They're probably going to trick you and hurt you. Maybe try doing this. Try eating some ice cream. Try this. Try that. Try all this stuff. You do all this stuff that the self is saying, but life just keeps on being painful and horrifying. It just gets worse. And then at some point you realize, wait a minute. That was never me. That was just a perception that showed up at some point that I started believing was me. And we see it fall away and we see, oh, wow. I am really glad that I didn't keep following that. Every time leading up to it, in my experience anyway, it feels existential. It feels like death. It feels like, like this is the worst thing ever. Definitely not this, anything but this. And every time, having moved beyond it, in a sense, really glad I didn't keep going with that. So that's just some stuff that comes to mind. I hope it's entertaining or helpful. Thank you for sharing it. I really appreciate seeing you here. Anything else?
I noticed that when you asked us to move on from somebody that's easy to love, somebody that's neutral, and somebody that's hard, I found it funny that the person that I chose that was hard was somebody that it's never hurt me, but I disagree with based on views I've heard. So, yeah, it's really, we really hold on to views.
It's really hard. It can be really. That was where I went to.
Hmm.
I went to someone who I disagree with. I won't tell you who they are. Actually, I went to 3 different people I disagreed with, and I couldn't decide who I was going to go with. But it was the same thing in all cases. So I disagree with you. So, yeah, really interesting. And sorry for you all, for posterity. The thing that was said by Kyle is that he found that the person he went to when it was time to pick a challenging person to send compassion to was someone who he disagreed with. And he was very surprised at how strongly we identify with views. That mere disagreement is enough to have a hard time being compassionate for someone who hasn't even hurt you. The person hadn't hurt him in any way. So, very significant. Mm-hmm.
So, who I always tend to go towards when it is time.
I'm afraid you've cut out. Could you maybe mute us, Zev, and Renee? Try.
Is this okay? Can you hear me?
Check if the speaker is still on. Okay, great. Yeah, it's audio issue on our end. The speaker is off, I take it.
Now you are muted. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. So we just unplugged it. The audio quality has gotten worse, but we can hear you. Sorry about that.
The quality is different. I wouldn't say it's a lot worse. So whenever I do this practice, I find that I try to go towards, I will name names, Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump. And it was really helpful when your prompt in there was pick someone feasible. It's like, oh, I don't have to go all the way there. And then that was really interesting to me to see there's a range here. Someone with whom I don't agree, someone who is difficult, does not have to be the standard bearer of all of it in my mind.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And the other thing that I have is this sort of a sense as we go through this process. I'm going through a process where I am discovering there's a Renee who believes this. And I didn't know that Renee existed until this, whatever this is proven to be untrue. And that's when it's revealed, look at that. Who knew that version of Renee was in there? And in some ways, it seems like my understanding of what it is to go through the stages from a caterpillar to a butterfly, that in each of those stages, this is what I believe I am. And as that begins to dissolve and shift, what does it seem like to let go of that and just be what the next thing is? And somehow here, from 65-year-old, it's not so scary anymore. I've seen this come, and I can sort of just ride it. That's
really wonderful. It's nice to hear that it's not so scary.
Yeah. Word. It's not.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, so for the person for whom it's challenging to feel compassion for, I definitely found it was easier for me to get distracted by like the next thing I want to say to them, like, or like, oh yeah, there's this like argument, or like this unfinished business that like I need to talk to them about, and so that was definitely part of that. Like, just oh my gosh, I got to come back to the practice, compassion, and I think I did okay in finding ways back to that. Like maybe phrases like like, oh, you know, may you like resolve the challenges that like you, may you grow in something like, yeah, may you grow in the areas that you find that you want to grow in, or yeah, like may you make progress in your spiritual path. Yeah, like what, you know, I'm always curious, like, oh, are there other ways into like feeling compassion for someone who's difficult to feel compassion for?
Yeah, right. Yeah, great. So, as you say, it's commonly the case that for such a person, we get distracted more often. We keep on finding ourselves going to this other thing, maybe that we want to say to them, or even just that we need to do later or something. So it's good just to notice that and take that on as a challenge. And then, so of course, there are a lot of strategies, techniques, approaches to it. One that Renee mentioned is you work your way up. You pick someone less challenging and get to compassion there, and then grow from there. Pick next person, next person, next person. It's one approach. And then another is, again, just to sort of keep it very simple and lower the stakes. To just say love, love, love to them. And just keep doing that. It can also be a starting point. Just you're spending some time with that idea and saying the word love. It's kind of starting something. There's just some thoughts that come to mind on that. Yeah, it is hard. Definitely.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So we have time for maybe one more something, one more share. Mm-hmm.
One more way with the challenging person is find something. If love is too big, if compassion is too big, friendliness, kindness, just ramp down that way as well. That works for me sometimes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Oh, yep.
I'd like to add something to that I experienced last week with Pan in a moment of guided inspiration last week. I noticed the sun through my backyard where I'm sitting in the same place. Oh my God, I'm going to choke up. So I extended the sunlight to this person I was thinking of, and it's the same sunlight that we're all experiencing. And the dark parts of the world right now, they're going to get that sunlight in a few minutes or a few hours. And it had nothing to do with what the violence they did to a place that I care about a few days ago. It just was the plain old sun. I'm very moved. I could not have joined this group at a better time. Thank you. All of you.
Thank you. That's extremely well seen and well said. It's, yeah. But very skillful. And it's often said this sun, this heart that we find shines everywhere. The sun is actually a metaphor that's used often. The sun shines everywhere, not just some places, but everywhere and on everyone. And it's also, I think, significant that this came after a significant challenge. It's often the case when things break like this, that we kind of, when we have no choice, we experience a deeper realization. We're put in an untenable situation in some way. And then breakthrough can happen. Thanks for sharing that. Thank you all for continuing to practice and doing everything that you're doing. Please take good care of yourselves. And please do reach out to me and the other residents and apprentices here. I know we all really care about you, and we all really love to spend time on the phone, or for socially distanced walk, or whatever it is that's feasible. Really want to stay in touch and support and care for you. Sorry? Oh yeah, last thing. Magic's last sit is this one.
It is.
So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
It's been really wonderful to have you here. And as they say, as we say in this tradition, there are 2 times we celebrate. When someone comes and when they leave. So I'm excited for you to into the world and work your magic.
This has been an amazing experience. I feel so expanded in just a little bit of time that I've been here, and just so blessed, and yet still hungry to learn more. So thank you so much for these real life lessons and experiences. So thank you, everybody, too, for being here and a part of my journey as well. Thank you.
Ashe.
All right. Well, so long.
Bye, everybody.